$10 doesn't buy you a hot meal anymore. For Cora, it bought a 2-ton liability of rotting wood and asbestos on the edge of town. She was 20, living out of a dented Corolla, and about to unearth a secret the city had kept buried for 90 years. The heater in the Corolla had given out somewhere around mid-November. By the first week of December, the cold inside the car was no longer just a temperature. It was a physical presence. It sat on Cora's chest while she slept. It seeped into the seams of her worn canvas jacket. At 20 years old, she had learned that exhaustion didn't knock you out. It kept you wired, your brain humming with a low-grade panic that never actually resolved into a solution. She had $14.62 to her name. Oak Haven was a city that had died 3 decades ago, but forgot to stop breathing. The downtown was a grid of pawn shops, payday lenders, and boarded-up storefronts. The municipal building was the only structure on Main Street that still had fully functioning plumbing. Cora sat in the back row of folding chairs in room 204, her hands jammed into her armpits to keep her fingers from going numb. The room smelled of industrial floor wax and stale coffee. Up front, a sweaty city clerk named Gregson was droning into a microphone that kept feeding back. This was the city's quarterly blight auction. Foreclosed properties, abandoned lots, and condemned structures were being auctioned off for the cost of back taxes, or in some cases, just to get the liability off the municipal balance sheet. Investors in cheap suits bought up the residential lots for a few $100, planning to flip them to out-of-state holding companies. Cora watched them, her jaw tight. She didn't have a grand plan. She just needed a place where the police wouldn't tap on her window at 3 a.m. She needed a roof. Lot 112, Gregson sighed, wiping his forehead with a crumpled tissue. The South Oak Haven Depot. Condemned status. Severe structural degradation. Asbestos abatement required before any commercial zoning permits can be issued. The city is offering a quitclaim deed. Minimum bid is $10. Silence settled over the room. One of the cheap suits up front snorted. The South Oak Haven Depot was a local joke. It was a massive, hulking ruin of blackened brick and shattered Gothic arched windows sitting on 2 acres of poisoned soil by the dead rut yards. Buying it meant inheriting a demolition bill that contractors estimated at $50,000. The city had been trying to unload it for 10 years. "Do I have $10? Gregson asked, looking at the clock on the back wall. $10 just to stop talking about it? Cora raised her hand. Heads turned. Gregson squinted through the fluorescent glare. "Boy, miss, you understand this property carries an immediate code enforcement rider. You can't live there. You can't operate a business there. You're just buying the privilege of paying to tear it down." "I have $10, Cora said. Her voice was scratchy from disuse. Gregson stared at her. He looked at her frayed jacket, the dark circles under her eyes, and the sheer, stubborn set of her jaw. A wave of bureaucratic apathy washed over him. It wasn't his job to save 20-year-old girls from stupid financial decisions. It was his job to clear the docket. "Sold," he muttered, striking a wooden gavel against the laminate table. "See the clerk at the side desk for your paperwork." 20 minutes later, Cora walked out into the freezing slush of Main Street. In her right pocket, she had $4.62. In her left pocket, she had a notarized quitclaim deed to an 80-year-old toxic ruin. She drove the Corolla to the south edge of town, where the street lights stopped working and the pavement turned to cracked, weed-choked asphalt. The depot loomed against the gray winter sky, like the rib cage of a rotting behemoth. The chain-link fence surrounding it had been cut and peeled back by scrap metal thieves years ago. Cora drove right through the gap. She idled the car in front of the main loading bay doors. They were massive, built of thick oak, but the bottom halves had rotted out, leaving jagged holes large enough to walk through. Cora turned off the engine. The silence was immediate and heavy. She grabbed her flashlight from the glove box, stepped out of the car, and walked through the broken doors. The air inside was 10 degrees colder than outside. It smelled of wet ash, pigeon guano, and century-old decay. The main concourse was cavernous. A high vaulted ceiling disappeared into the shadows above. Ribbons of pale afternoon light filtered through the shattered skylights, illuminating millions of dust motes dancing in the dead air. Graffiti covered the lower 10 feet of the brick walls. Trash littered the floor, soggy mattresses, fast food wrappers, rusted spray paint cans. But it was dry, mostly. The roof had held up better than the city assumed. Cora walked slowly toward the center of the concourse. Her footsteps echoed off the brick. Already, she was completely alone. For the first time in 2 years, nobody could tell her to move along. Nobody could tow her car. She drove the Corolla straight through the rotted bay doors, parking it deep inside the shadow of the concourse so it couldn't be seen from the street. She locked the doors out of habit, then realized she was the only one with a claim to the locks. She spent the first night in the driver's seat, wrapped in 2 sleeping bags. The wind howled through the broken glass, an eerie, mournful sound that sounded like a dying train whistle. It was terrifying. It was freezing, but it was hers. Survival narrows your focus. You stop thinking about 5 years from now, or even 5 days from now. You think about the next meal, the next source of heat, the next safe place to lay your head. By day 3, Cora realized the concourse was unlivable. It was too massive to retain any heat. If she was going to survive the incoming January freezes, she needed a smaller, defensible space. She found it in the old ticket booth. Built into the eastern wall of the concourse, the booth was a room within a room. It had solid mahogany walls that had somehow escaped the worst of the rot, a heavy door that still possessed its iron hinges, and a thick, wrought iron grill over the main window where the clerk used to take money. The frosted glass was mostly shattered, but Cora used a roll of heavy-duty duct tape and some thick plastic sheeting she scavenged from a nearby construction dumpster to seal the gaps. It was an 8 by 10 foot box. It felt like a cage, which meant it felt secure. She spent Tuesday clearing it out. The physical labor was brutal. The floor was covered in a thick layer of hardened mud, mouse droppings, and decades of accumulated filth. She used a flattened piece of scrap metal as a makeshift shovel, scraping the detritus into heavy-duty trash bags. Her hands blistered, her muscles screamed. She was running on a diet of stale peanut butter and tap water she hauled in jugs from a gas station 2 miles away. By mid-afternoon, she hit the original floorboards. She wiped her forehead with the back of her grimy sleeve, kneeling to inspect the floor. It was beautiful, thick-cut oak, gray with age but solid. She used a wet rag to scrub away the last layer of grime near the back wall, where the clerk's stool would have been bolted down. As she pushed the rag across the wood, it caught on something sharp. Cora cursed, looking at a deep slice in her thumb. A drop of bright red blood welled up, stark against the gray dirt on her skin. She sucked on the cut, peering closely at the floor. The rag had snagged on a nail head, but it wasn't like the round wire nails she had seen sticking out of the framing in the concourse. This was a square-headed, hand-forged iron nail. It had worked its way up by a fraction of an inch. Cora traced the edge of the floorboard with her thumb. The seam was incredibly tight, but it was there. She tapped the board with her knuckles. Thud. Solid wood over concrete. She moved her hand a few inches to the left, tapping the adjacent board. Thwack! Cora froze. She tapped it again. The sound was distinct. It was hollow. The board didn't sit flush against the subfloor. It sat over a void. She sat back on her heels. Cynicism had been her primary survival tool since she aged out of the foster system. When things looked promising, they were usually traps. A hollow floorboard in a condemned building didn't mean treasure. It meant a rotted-out sinkhole, or a nest of aggressive rats, or a collapsed pipe. But curiosity is a stubborn thing. She walked out to the Corolla and dug a rusty tire iron out of the trunk. Returning to the ticket booth, she wedged the flat, wedged end of the iron into the microscopic seam between the oak boards. She leaned her weight into it. The wood didn't give. It had been sitting there for nearly a century, swelling and settling into place. Cora adjusted her grip, braced her boots against the wall, and threw her entire body weight backward. The ancient iron nail shrieked as it pulled free. The wood groaned, splitting slightly at the edge, and then popped upward. A rush of stale, dry air hit her face. It didn't smell like the mildewed rot of the rest of the depot. It smelled like dust, old paper, and machine oil. Cora pried up the first board, tossing it aside. She jammed the iron under the second board. It came up easier. Then a third. Beneath the floor was a rectangular cavity dug directly into the concrete foundation. It was lined with heavy, oil-soaked canvas, which had protected the interior from the dampness that destroyed the rest of the building. Sitting in the center of the canvas was a trunk. It wasn't a pirate's chest. It was a utilitarian, heavy-gauge steel lockbox, about the size of a microwave, painted a dull olive drab. The corners were reinforced with brass that had turned heavily green with patina. A heavy iron padlock secured the latch. Cora stared at it. Her pulse thumped a dull, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She didn't gasp. She just looked at it, forgetting to exhale. She reached down and touched the lid. The steel was freezing. It was real. She grabbed the tire iron, wedged it through the loop of the padlock, and twisted. The lock was rusted internal solid. It snapped with a sharp crack that echoed off the mahogany walls like a gunshot. Cora pulled the broken lock away. Her hands were shaking now. She didn't want them to shake, but the adrenaline was dumping into her bloodstream. She wedged her fingers under the heavy steel lip of the lid and lifted. It opened with a metallic sigh. Inside, there were no gold bars. There were no diamonds. Cora let out a harsh, self-deprecating laugh, feeling the tension drain out of her shoulders. Of course, she thought, just an old box of garbage. The trunk was packed to the brim with tightly rolled, wax-sealed cylinders. They looked like oversized candles. Beside them sat a stack of leather-bound books, their covers cracked and peeling. Cora picked up one of the heavy ledgers. She opened it carefully. The paper was stiff, yellowed at the edges, but perfectly legible. It was filled with neat, slanted, cursive handwriting in faded black ink. Dates ran down the left margin. October 14th, 1928. November 2nd, 1928. Columns of numbers followed the dates, but it was the names next to the numbers that made Cora pause. Vanderwall. Miller. Sterling. Wait, no, she recognized the names from the street signs downtown. Vanderwall. Miller. Carmichael. Hayes. These were the founding families of Oak Haven, the people whose descendants currently owned the police department, the city council, and the very ground she was sitting on. Next to each name were staggering amounts of money and brief, cryptic notes. Payment received. Cargo diverted to Chicago. Judge silenced. $4,000. It was a ledger, a bootlegger's ledger, detailing systematic bribery and extortion that built the foundation of Oak Haven's elite class. Cora swallowed hard. She set the book down and reached for one of the wax-sealed cylinders. She dug her fingernails into the hardened wax, cracking it off in chunks to reveal a thick roll of paper underneath. Payday, she unrolled it carefully, afraid it would crumble. It didn't. The paper was a high-quality, linen-cotton blend. She stared down at the face of Alexander Hamilton. But it wasn't a normal $10 bill. The seal on the right side wasn't green. It was a brilliant, unfaded gold. The lettering across the top read, Gold Certificate, and the number in the corner wasn't 10. It was $1,000. Cora thumbed the edge of the roll. It wasn't just one bill. It was a stack of them, as thick as her wrist, pristine and perfectly preserved. She looked back into the trunk. There were dozens of these cylinders. She was 20 years old. She had $4.62 in her pocket, and she was sitting on the floor of a condemned $10 ruin, staring at a ghost's fortune. Cora did not sleep that night. She sat with her back against the mahogany wall of the ticket booth, her knees pulled to her chest, watching the open cavity in the floor. A single battery-powered lantern cast sharp, erratic shadows across the room. Every time the wind shrieked through the concourse outside, her hand twitched toward the heavy tire iron resting beside her thigh. A fortune is a dangerous thing when you have no front door. She spent the hours between midnight and dawn calculating. The ledgers were damning. They detailed murders framed as industrial accidents, payoffs to federal prohibition agents, and the systematic bleeding of the working class by the men who built Oak Haven. But the gold certificates were an entirely different problem. Cora knew enough about poverty to understand that money wasn't just paper, it was a system. If a homeless 20-year-old walked into a Chase branch with a pristine, uncirculated 1928 $1,000 gold certificate, she wouldn't leave with cash. She would leave in the back of a police cruiser under investigation for grand larceny or fraud. She needed an intermediary. Someone who operated in the gray space between legal tender and historical artifacts. At 8 in the morning, Cora carefully placed 2 of the certificates into a plastic zip-top bag, folded the bag into the inner pocket of her jacket, and covered the cavity in the floor with the oak boards. She dragged a rotting desk over the loose wood to hide the seams. The drive to the neighboring city of Bridgeport took an hour. The Corolla's engine knocked the entire way, a rhythmic reminder of her precarious reality. She bypassed the bright, modern banks downtown and parked in front of a heavily barred storefront wedged between a liquor store and a dry cleaner. The faded awning read, "Higgins Numismatics and Antiquities." A bell chimed harshly as she pushed the heavy glass door open. The shop smelled intensely of pipe tobacco, lemon polish, and old copper. Behind a reinforced glass counter stood a man in his late 60s. He wore a tweed vest that looked unwashed and thick, wire-rimmed glasses that magnified his watery blue eyes. He glanced up from a jeweler's loupe, took one look at Cora's frayed canvas jacket and dirt-smudged face, and sighed. "I don't buy stolen silver jewelry, kid," Higgins rasped. His voice sounded like boots crunching on gravel. "And I don't appraise inherited pocket watches unless you're paying the $50 fee up front." Cora didn't reply. She walked to the counter, unzipped her jacket, and pulled out the plastic bag. She slid it under the narrow opening at the bottom of the security glass. Higgins looked down. He didn't reach for it. He simply stared. The air in the shop suddenly felt very heavy. The steady ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner seemed to grow louder, amplifying the absolute silence between them. Slowly, deliberately, Higgins pulled a pair of white cotton gloves from his pocket and slipped them on. He picked up the bag, unsealed it, and drew out the first certificate. He moved it under a harsh, high-intensity desk lamp. He examined the intricate golden seal. He traced the serial numbers. He flipped it over, inspecting the bright green ink on the reverse side. "Where did you get this?" he asked. His voice was no longer gravelly. It was a tight, controlled whisper. "Is it real?" Cora asked, her tone entirely flat. She refused to give him an inch. Higgins looked up, his watery eyes narrowing. "It's a 1928 series. It's uncirculated. The paper grain is flawless. Yes, it's real. And under the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, it was supposed to be surrendered to the federal government. For decades, holding one of these was a federal crime. It's legal to own now, as a collectible, but finding one in this condition is an anomaly. Finding 2 is a statistical impossibility." "What is the market value?" Cora asked. Higgins hesitated. He calculated his angle. "A bank will give you face value, $1,000, but no bank will touch it without a federal hold and an origin trace. I can offer you $5,000 cash, right now. No paperwork. You walk out the door." $5,000. To Cora, it was a staggering, unimaginable sum. It meant a heated apartment. It meant a working car. It meant hot meals for months. Her empty stomach cramped violently at the thought, but cynicism had kept her alive. She looked at his trembling hands. "You're shaking," she said softly. You're trying to hide it, but your left hand is trembling, which means 5,000 is an insult. She reached under the glass partition. Give them back. Higgins jerked his hand away, instinctively clutching the bills. Wait, listen to me. The market for high-denomination currency is niche. These regularly auction for $20,000 to $30,000 to private collectors. But auction houses take 20%. They require provenance, and the IRS will take another 30% of the capital gains. I'm offering you $15,000. Cash, today. Cora stared at him. She didn't blink. I don't just have two. Higgins stopped breathing. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. How many? Enough, Cora said. I need a lawyer. Someone quiet. Someone who hates the banks in Oak Haven. You find me the lawyer, you facilitate the private sales, and I'll give you a 10% broker's fee on the total volume. Higgins took off his glasses. He wiped his face with a handkerchief. He looked at the bruised, exhausted 20-year-old standing in front of him, realizing he was entirely outmatched. I know a guy, he muttered. Arthur. He used to be a prosecutor in Oak Haven before the Carmichael family had him disbarred for looking too closely at their zoning permits. He handles unorthodox estates. Call him, Cora commanded. The meeting took place 72 hours later. Cora insisted on her own territory. It was 20 degrees outside, and the South Oak Haven depot felt like an ice box. The wind whipped through the shattered skylights, sending tiny cyclones of dust dancing across the brick floor. Cora stood in the center of the main concourse. Beside her stood Arthur, a tall, skeletal man in a heavy wool overcoat, clutching a leather briefcase. Arthur had spent 2 days authenticating the ledgers and drawing up airtight, impenetrable corporate structures. He was a man fueled by vengeance, and Cora had handed him a loaded weapon. At exactly noon, a sleek, black Mercedes G-Wagon pulled through the broken chain-link fence, crunching over the frozen debris. 2 men got out. The first was a massive, thick-necked man in a tailored suit, Brahma Security. The second was Richard Carmichael. He was the current mayor of Oak Haven, the CEO of Oak Haven Mutual, and the grandson of the man whose name appeared 74 times in the bootlegger's ledger. Carmichael looked disgusted. He stepped over a soggy mattress, his expensive leather shoes catching on discarded wires. Arthur, Carmichael sneered, stopping 10 feet away. I heard you were doing bottom feeder work, but I didn't realize you were holding meetings in condemned landfills. Arthur smiled. It was a cold, reptilian expression. Hello, Richard. Thank you for coming. Carmichael's gaze shifted to Cora. He looked at her the way one might look at a stray dog. This is the client? You dragged me away from a city council budget hearing because a vagrant claims to have my grandfather's lost diaries. Not diaries, Cora said. Her voice echoed sharply off the vaulted ceiling. Ledgers. She didn't move. She didn't fidget. She held his gaze with a terrifying, unblinking intensity. Carmichael frowned. People usually shrank under his attention. This girl stood like she owned the concrete she was standing on. Technically, she did. Cora reached into her jacket and pulled out a single sheet of heavy linen paper. It was a photocopy Arthur had made. She let it drop to the floor. The wind caught it, skittering it across the dirty bricks until it stopped at Carmichael's feet. He looked down. He recognized the neat, slanted handwriting immediately. April 12th, 1929. $12,000 paid to Chief Inspector Davis. Warehouse 4 secured for Canadian imports. 3 dock workers silenced. Carmichael's arrogant posture dissolved. His shoulders stiffened. He stared at the photocopy for a long, heavy moment before looking back up at Cora. The disgust in his eyes had been replaced by pure, cold calculation. What do you want? He asked quietly. I have the originals, Cora said, her breath pluming in the freezing air. 86 pages detailing every bribe, every extortion, and every body your grandfather buried to build your family's fortune. I know about the land grabs. I know how your family acquired the very municipal building you sit in. If this goes to the state attorney general, the historical society, and the national press, the Carmichael name becomes synonymous with organized crime. Your upcoming gubernatorial run dies today. Extortion is a felony, Carmichael hissed. It's not extortion, Arthur interjected smoothly, stepping forward. My client is merely offering to sell historical documents to a private collector. The price of these documents is subjective, of course, based on their sentimental value to your family. How much? Carmichael demanded. Cora shook her head. I don't want your money. I have my own. Carmichael blinked, confused. Then what the hell are we doing here? I have a substantial collection of 1928 gold certificates, Cora explained slowly, speaking to him as if he were a slow child. They are authentic, but difficult to liquidate through traditional channels without triggering IRS audits and federal inquiries. Your family owns Oak Haven Mutual. You have a private wealth management division that specializes in discrete, high-net-worth acquisitions and asset integration. Carmichael stared at her, the realization slowly dawning on him. You will process the certificates, Cora continued, her voice hard as steel. You will purchase them through your bank at full collector's market value, $25,000 per note. You will absorb the tax liabilities. You will open a clean, fully legitimized account in my name, and you will push through an emergency municipal grant to fully fund the asbestos abatement and structural restoration of this train depot. Silence fell over the concourse, broken only by the howling wind. Carmichael looked at the young woman in the ragged jacket. He was being backed into a corner by a ghost from 1928 and a homeless 20-year-old. And the ledgers? He asked. Once the account is funded, the taxes are paid, and the restoration crews break ground on this building. Arthur will deliver the trunk to your office, Cora said. You can burn them in your fireplace. I don't care about your grandfather's sins. I only care about my future. Carmichael looked at his security guard, then at Arthur, and finally back at Cora. He hated her. He hated her absolute, unwavering calm, but he was a businessman. He recognized a clean deal when he saw one. It would cost his bank a few million to process the certificates and another million to fix the depot. A drop in the bucket to protect a billion-dollar political legacy. Send the paperwork to my private office, Carmichael muttered to Arthur. He turned on his heel and walked back to the Mercedes without another word. Cora watched the taillights disappear through the broken fence. The adrenaline finally crashed, and her knees buckled slightly. Arthur caught her arm, steadying her. You did good, kid, Arthur said softly. You got them. Cora looked up at the shattered skylights. The gray sky was beginning to clear, revealing a patch of pale winter blue. She pulled her jacket tight against the cold, feeling the solid oak floors of her ticket booth waiting for her in the shadows. Yeah, Cora whispered, a faint, genuine smile finally touching her lips. I'm going home. If Cora's story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share this video with someone who loves a true underdog tale. We explore hidden histories, forgotten mysteries, and the incredible secrets buried right beneath our feet. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our next deep dive into the unknown. Leave a comment down below. What would you do if you found a fortune under the floorboards?